Greetings, my benefactors! It's your local anti-citizen femboy Slayer here. Can you believe that Half-Life 2 is 20 years old now? God, just acknowledging that fact makes me want to bawl my eyes out. But hey, the fact we're still talking about it is proof that this game's popularity ain't going anywhere in the years to come. In fact, its legacy lives on outside the realm of the actual game, in Gary's mod, for both good and bad. As for the game itself, you don't need me to say it, you already know it's a masterpiece. With incredible physics and graphics that were light years ahead of everyone else in 2004, that surprisingly still hold up decently, an incredible campaign that's a blast from start to finish, and if that's not enough for you, arguably the best modding scene in all of gaming. So if you can't get enough of Half-Life 2, there are legions of fans willing to give us more Half-Life, since Valve spent years not making a follow-up to this game, and only giving us a VR-exclusive spin-off starring Alex just a couple years ago. But what if I told you that things could have turned out differently for Half-Life 2? There was a 6-year gap between Half-Life 1 and 2, and even an infamous leak of the game in 2003, just a year before release. Aside from giving us an unfinished version of the final game, also leaked were literally over 1,000 maps that pointed to a noticeably different game than the one we got. Dated from early 2001 to 2003, these maps show that the game went through a multitude of changes, with many concepts and such that simply didn't make it to the final game. I'm talking about entire maps, set pieces, story plots, and a buttload of cut weapons. All of this shows that during those 6 years, Half-Life 2 evolved greatly into the game that we know and love. But many over the years have argued that these changes weren't for the better, and that the game we got was actually worse than the beta. I guess you can say that the beta was just beta. I apologize for that pun. Which is simply crazy to think about. Usually a beta is just a rough, unfinished version of what we get in the end. But Half-Life 2's beta is so different that it might as well be a scrapped game entirely. This has led to a strong cult fanbase surrounding Half-Life 2's beta, and even many mods attempting to recreate it. I will get into some of those mods later on, but for now, I want to take a look at these beta maps, how the game evolved, and whether or not the beta really was beta. So be a true citizen and put on your gas mask as we venture into the rabbit hole that is the Half-Life 2 beta. 1999 and 2000 were mostly preliminary and test work for Half-Life 2's story and setting, but by 2001 we can see that they already had something going, and something way different than the game we got in the end. In this universe, the Combine are replacing the atmosphere with toxic gases, requiring citizens to wear gas masks. And City 17 was a much darker and much different city. Instead of the post-Soviet Eastern Europe setting, this City 17 is an amalgamation of New York City and Chicago, with a noticeably green hue to it, almost like Fallout 3. This version is just so hopeless and depressing, and makes the retail version look like sunshine and rainbows in comparison. I really love the atmosphere in these early City 17 maps. It's so dark, grungy, and industrial in parts. At one point in the story, we were supposed to take a plane ride back to the city, which ends up crashing into a skyscraper. This part of the game is so cool. They clearly poured a lot of love and passion into it, and it really shows in how atmospheric the level design is, minus the unfinished geometry in parts. But it should be obvious to anyone why this part of the game was cut. A plane crashing into a skyscraper in a New York-inspired setting? Do I even need to spell it out what that reminds you of? Yeah, the Vertigo section simply was something that would never make it in a timeline where 9/11 happened, which is a shame. Another thing that would have been cut regardless is the child slavery thing. Yeah, the Combine had child slave labor at one point, and that definitely would have been something too risky to add into a game. Keep in mind that there's a good reason that children don't appear in GTA games. Another fan favorite beta setting was the Depot and Air Exchange. This was the original inspiration for the City 17 uprising in the game, and a precursor to the Nova Prospect level in the final game. Once again, the atmosphere is just through the roof, with the industrial interior and that magnificent sunset. Just looking at that skybox makes me want to release protein chains important to the process of embryonic development. There were some settings in the Arctic that were also planned, such as this Arctic base and the Borealis. The Borealis would briefly appear in Episode 2, but here in the beta, it would have played a much larger role in the story. And it's definitely an interesting setting. Both retail Half-Life 1 and 2 take place almost entirely within Black Mesa and City 17 and its surrounding areas. So having an area far outside of City 17 would definitely be interesting. In order to avoid breaking that perfect Half-Life flow, we would have teleported to the Borealis. I really like this setting. A ship on the Arctic definitely gives off an incredible vibe, and would have added some extra diversity to the game. I'm only on the 2001 version, and I've already noticed that so much stuff was cut from retail, and about the only thing that made it into the retail version that's semi-recognizable were the canals and Quarrytown, which is basically a proto-Ravenholm, and even those are clearly unfinished versions of what we get later. It's incredible to think how different Half-Life 2 was at this stage in development. They clearly made a lot of progress here, so this wasn't just some brief-lived experiment in the development process, this was something that they were originally set on sticking with until later on. There are also some character differences as well. On the Borealis, we would meet a character named Odell, who would later evolve into the very briefly seen Odessa Cubbage in the final game. Talk about a waste! Dr. Kleiner was originally going to look like this, Eli Maxwell was the prototype version of Eli Vance, and Alex Vance had a somewhat different appearance and voice as well.
What do you mean you speak for humanity? You can't speak for something you're not a part of anymore. Call yourself Consul or whatever you want, but you're really just another cog in the Combine machinery.
The biggest difference is definitely the beta version of Dr. Breen. In this version, known as the Consul, as opposed to the more realistic corporate optimism type of propaganda he spews in the final game, in this version, he is basically just a cartoonish dictator with a bald head who lectures his enslaved population on what is and isn't a true citizen.
The true citizen knows that duty is the greatest gift. The true citizen appreciates the comforts of City 17, but uses discretion.
So we are definitely dealing with a pretty different, but also slightly familiar game here. We're still dealing with an Orwellian dystopia in Combine rule, but it's even more dark and depressing than the final game, and some of the concepts are, in my opinion, a lot more interesting. There were also a lot, and I do mean a lot, of cut weapons, such as an AK-47, Molotov cocktails, an MP5K, an unfinished LMG, an ice pick, and so much more. Compare that to like the 8 weapons that we have in the final game, it really just feels like Valve threw away a lot of cool stuff here. Sure, Half-Life 2 really didn't need so many weapons as to making scrolling through them an arduous task, but a few extra weapons would be really cool. Also, not gonna lie, I much prefer the OICW over the Combine rifle that we got in the final game. I always found the latter to be kinda ugly. By 2002, the game was starting to shift into something closer to the final game. The toxic, unbreathable air was removed, hence the eventual removal of the fantastic air exchange level, and the design of City 17 shifted towards a more European style. This period of the game's development was a transition between the extremely dark 2001 version and the more cheerful final product. The levels are more polished visually and design-wise. Many of the 2001 levels look like they were built on a somewhat more advanced version of the Gold Source engine, but by this point, major strides had been made in terms of visuals. Major strides. Fun fact, Valve were originally going to reveal Half-Life 2 at E3 2002, but bailed. I could only imagine gamers getting to see this game in a time when we had only just gotten over the PS1 era of gaming. This simply would have been incredible to see back then. This is where some of the level design we see in the final game starts to appear. We have an early version of the City 17 Plaza, the Kleiner's Lab from the final game appears as well, just with a larger teleportation room, and a different looking teleporter. We also have some familiar looking sewer sections as well, which are quite similar to the ones in the final game, just less detailed. And Ravenholm already largely resembled the retail version, minus the pier section of the level. So, while we still have a darker and grittier game than the retail version, many familiar things from retail make their appearance in this period of development. There are still many differences in things that were cut later on. For one, the Citadel went through many variations during development, before settling on the iconic design we all know and love. The earliest known model looking like a piece of rusty metal, I mean, what the hell even is this? Then it looked like this. Well, that's better. By 2002, it was shaping into something more futuristic, and then they briefly experimented with this much shorter design, before settling on the iconic final design. The interior was drastically different prior to 2003, looking much more industrial as opposed to the futuristic design we have in retail, and it even featured prison cells. Oh my god! Is that what the gravity gun originally looked like? I can't imagine something like this making it into the final product. It looks so ugly, and Gordon's holding it OG Doom style. Thank God they changed it in release. Also, fun fact, the physics gun that we all know and love from Gary's mod was originally going to be a weapon in the Half-Life 2 beta. Maddie, can you shut the hell up? The code for it was left in the game and used to give us the famous physics gun from Gmod. Anyways, another cut location from the 2001 and 2002 version is Kraken Base, which we were supposed to visit after the Borealis. Here, we were supposed to acquire a fire extinguisher. Kinda reminds me of GTA San Andreas. It was here that I also learned that NPCs can't climb ladders. Lol. The previous Vertigo section returned here, but with a different looking skyscraper, an interior that looks like a museum, and we would have crashed a helicopter into the building instead of a plane, so it isn't as evocative as 9/11 as previously. One section that was missing almost entirely from the final game was the wasteland in the aspect of ocean draining. We would have traveled across dried up seabeds on our way to the depot, i.e. Proto Nova Prospect. In the final game, this is replaced by an admittedly gorgeous coastal drive, and the ocean draining aspect has been dialed down so severely to the point of it being a mere low tide. When I first played Half-Life 2, I didn't even know the oceans were still being drained. That's how bad this downgrade is. Considering the fact that the drained oceans appeared in the E3 2003 presentation, this was a change made somewhat late into development. There are also many cool enemies in this iteration of the game, such as Hound Eyes, Bull Squids, Combine Cremators, Hydras, Combine Guards, and these scorching hot Combine Assassins. I have to ask again, why were these awesome enemies cut? These would have added more diversity to the combat in the game, and some extra challenge as well. I love the final game, don't get me wrong, it's a masterpiece, but it's just baffling that they'd throw away this many weapons, enemies, and set pieces. I can name the amount of enemies we have in the final game on like one hand. Combine and Civil Protection, zombies, head crabs, antlions, and striders. Maybe there's a few more, but I'm just forgetting them. So there's less diversity in the enemy and weapon roster in the final game than in the beta. That's just crazy to think about, and one of the worst things that happened during Half-Life 2's development cycle. Now we reach 2003, the same year that Half-Life 2 got revealed and also leaked onto the internet. Imagine how long it would take to download the Half-Life 2 leak with 2003 internet. Contrary to popular belief, Half-Life 2 was not made brighter and less gritty due to the leak, because in that leak, alongside the beta files, was a playable, albeit unfinished version of Half-Life 2 that's very similar to the final product. There are some cut sections. In the Ravenholm level, there was originally going to be a rock mining section complete with its own vehicle. I know it's unfinished, but man, this thing controls like ass. And I'm not talking about the good kind of ass either. I'm talking about a fat, stinky, hairy, unwiped ass. Same thing goes for the dune buggy. It doesn't control so smoothly, and I once got myself stuck and unable to get out of the damn thing. Some of the underground sections from later in the game originally appeared in the sewers part of the game, presumably moved as to not make the sewers section feel drawn out. There's also just a lot of weirdness in this version. Stuff like self-driving dune buggies around City 17, this legit freaked me out when I first saw it. And a Pepsi machine.
All I want's a Pepsi, and she wouldn't get it to me.
Because sure, the Combine would totally let their enslaved human population indulge in such carbonated, sugary goodness. There are also a lot of untextured parts and levels, and many famous sequences we all know and love from the final game are just blatantly unfinished placeholders. This revealed to the world that Half-Life 2 was not ready for its originally intended fall 2003 release, and so, thanks to that, the game was delayed for another year. But in that time, Valve managed to polish up what they had into the iconic masterpiece we all know and love. But as I've demonstrated throughout this video, Valve had already cut a lot of cool stuff out of their game, and so this leak also shows us a ton of wasted potential. Cut content is simply a fact of any game really, and it's always a bit of a disappointment when certain cool things don't make the cut. But Half-Life 2 is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest example of cut content in gaming history. There were obviously levels and features in the beta that weren't fun or simply didn't work right. I hear the opening walking segment was actually much longer in the beta, and there were some weapons we didn't need, or would have been game-breaking. But much of what I've shown in this video didn't really make much sense to cut, not to mention how much they watered down the dystopian atmosphere as things progressed. In a way, it actually makes retail Half-Life 2 look kinda disappointing. And I'm not alone in thinking that. Like I've said, there is a large cult fanbase surrounding the beta and its many concepts and features. Sure, in many ways, retail is better, it's more realistic and handles the dystopian themes with far more nuance, and the suppression field is actually far darker and more compelling than the original child slavery theme, and gives an even bigger reason to hate the Combine. But at the same time, the original dark Art Deco City 17, grittier tone, and cut weapons and enemies are really cool, and I wish that retail contained at least some of those elements. But hey, thanks to the leak, many fans have actually gone out of their way to create their own playable versions of the beta, like if Half-Life 2 had been released with the original dark tone. There are a few, but there's one in particular that I'd like to recommend. Raising the Bar Redux. This mod adds elements of the 2001 and 2002 version of the game with familiar ones from retail, and it's honestly one of the very best Half-Life 2 mods out there. If you ever wanted a gorgeous looking, incredible playing version of the Half-Life 2 beta, this is it. It's not just some cheap mod either, it's very well made and professional, with beautiful recreations and reimaginings of many fan-favorite parts of the beta. Not just many of our favorite cut levels, but also cut weapons as well, such as the AK-47, OICW, and Incinerator. Oh, and we even get to use Alex's pistol and Father Gregori's lever action at one point, which is pretty damn cool. Remember that mining section I mentioned earlier? Yeah, it's in here too. Only this time it doesn't control like absolute But it's not just a compilation of simply recreated beta stuff. We have some new levels as well, such as an even darker version of the canals and airboat section, and City 17 featuring a unique mixture of Art Deco and Soviet-style architecture. Overall, the game has that darker, more oppressive atmosphere that many of us beta fans love. Raising the Bar Redux is a mod every Half-Life fan should play. It gives you that awesome beta atmosphere with the graphical polish of Black Mesa. Anyways, I want to end this on a positive note, because it may sound like I dislike Half-Life 2 and Valve for the game not coming out dark and edgy, but I really don't. The final product is still incredible and has tons of atmosphere. And I agree, it's one of the best first-person shooters of all time. And big credit to Valve, they didn't try to act like the beta doesn't exist. In fact, they talk about it extensively in the 2004 book Half-Life 2: Raising the Bar, which I will link a PDF of in the description below. If you want a physical copy, those can go for upwards of $300, and I'm not recommending you try that in this economy. This book goes into detail the development of Half-Life 2, including the original plot, settings, and cut content. So hey, Valve was open about this cool stuff, and they let the modding community make all sorts of beta-themed mods, which is much more than I can say about a lot of game devs nowadays. I think that's a good way to end things off. So remember, the true citizen likes and subscribes, and also follows me on my socials as well. I'd actually highly recommend the latter since I'm more of an artist now than I am a YouTuber. The site sucks. So please do follow me on my Instagram. This is your local Trash Panda Slayer, signing off.